Well, thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to talk to you all about muscadines because they are certainly one of my favorite fruits to eat uh, and also to work with and all sorts of stuff. So, as Brooklyn said, I am new to the University of Georgia, but I was born and raised outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. So I have grown up eating muscadines my whole life. And I'm very excited to be back in the South in order to work with them. But I'll just get started. Luckily, we already had this intro, so we do know that we do have about a 50-50 range of people who have either already have muscadines and do not. So we'll both focus a little bit on some of the stuff that you need either to pick new cultivars or to help maintain the stuff that you already got. So great. And I'm kind of tempering this more for either a homeowner or a you pick enterprise office. But if we do have some larger growers present, feel free to just stick that in the chat too. And I can also make sure to ding when there's things that are going to be a little different for larger commercial productions. But for that, if you do not know or are not very familiar with muscadines, they are a type of grape. And generally, we have all types of our grapes are going to be in the Vitis genera, the Vitis genus, I should say. And more recently, there have been a lot of different changes in the taxonomy, and I'm not going to go into the taxonomy because I'm going to confuse myself if I do. But our grapes are generally going to be categorized into two subgenus categories, which are going to be the Muscadinia, which is where our muscadines are located, and then the U Vitis, which is our bunch grapes. Which is kind of some of those more commonly known grapes throughout the rest of the world. So that's Vitis vinifera is the European wine grape, is grown in the mountains of Georgia, as well as across the US. So that's going to be your Chardonnay, your Cabernet Sauvignon, those are different cultivars of the Vitis vinifera group, as well as some other Native American species, such as the Labrusca species, which is our Concord grape, is in that category. But we're mostly going to be focusing today on our Muscadinia, our Vitis rotundifolia. There are a couple different Muscadinia species that are much smaller in range, but most of the time this makes up the vast majority of the grapes, individuals and species cultivars that are grown in the muscadine group. And we are native to the Southeast. Muscadinia rotundifolia is native to the Southeast of the US. And in Georgia here, we are the leading producer in the world for muscadines. And over in the Southeast for the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, we have the biggest concentration of that production. So I'm very excited to be working with this group because not only because it's native, it's a much more easier plant to work with than some of our U Vitis group, which can sometimes will grow, but sometimes takes a lot of effort to get going. One question that I often get is about scuppernongs, which, especially being from North Carolina, this is often what we are calling our muscadines. But our scuppernong is actually just a type of muscadine. So like a square is a type of rectangle, but a rectangle is not necessarily a square. But scuppernong was just one of the very first isolated, one of the first cultivated muscadine cultivars. It was selected along the Scuppernong River in North Carolina, which is why it's how it got its name. And this is just some of the old picture, the botanical photo of that. But it's traditionally a bronze green fruit, but not necessarily all bronze green muscadines you see are going to be scuppernongs. And while you can still certainly see a fair amount of this grown across the Southeast, especially, it's not necessarily one that is grown very much in commercial plantings anymore because it is not necessarily the most productive. And there are often other cultivars that are bigger berries with sometimes better flavor, although you can certainly still very much enjoy some scuppernongs. They are still very tasty. But it's also the type of plant that is our oldest grapevine in North America. This is the mother vine, which is over in the Roanoke Colony in North Carolina, Outer Banks. But it takes about a third of an acre, I believe, is the estimate for how much land this one vine covers. So it is quite an old vine. It's not sure exactly when it went in the ground, but it's estimated it was either mid 15th century is when most of them will say it was grown, but it potentially went in like 1770. I've also seen some information on that as well. But in any case, muscadines are still a very diverse group of plants. You have all sorts of different color berries, all sorts of different sizes, and we see a lot of that diversity here in Georgia. And one of those is because we have the benefit of having a muscadine breeder through the oldest muscadine breeding program in the country. And this is run by Dr. Patrick Connor, who's located in Tifton. And so a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking for the next couple slides on the cultivar choice, one was adapted from some of the slides that Patrick has put out, but also is going to be based in Tifton. So a lot of it's a really good benefit for being for y'all in Pike County, because it's not too far. So things that grow well in Tifton are probably going to be pretty good for growing in Pike County. But one of the big three questions that I need y'all to think about for choosing your cultivar choice is what do you want a juice cultivar, or do you want to primarily have it for juice, or you want something that is tastier to eat fresh? We're going to mostly talk about fresh eating stuff, although we will touch a little bit on the juice grapes. How many plants you want to have. So if you're just wanting to put 1 or 2 vines in your yard, that's perfectly fine. They do great. But that will make a difference on which cultivar you're going to choose. And if you have a preference for color and how long you want that harvest time to last. But for fresh eating or juice cultivars, while oftentimes some of these wine juice cultivars are some of the more popular ones that have been planted. And that's one, because they produce high yields of fruit, generally have pretty good high sugar content for a muscadine. But the focus for those wine and juice cultivars is less on how good they are to eat normally. So especially if you're not one that likes to eat the muscadine skin like I do, it can be a rather tougher skin that's not necessarily going to be quite as tasty. And then they tend to be much smaller berries as well. But our fresh market cultivars are focusing on one, large and firmer berries. So there's going to have a texture that's a little different, a dry picking scar, which we'll talk a little bit more on. But while we have a lot of newer cultivars that are coming in, which are focused on becoming maybe a little bit more palatable to a wider group of audience. While I grew up loving muscadines and their thick skins and gummy texture, that's not necessarily everyone's favorite texture. So this is going to be a little bit more of a wider audience that you can get to some of these newer cultivars. And if you're just looking to do some small batches of juice for either quick eating juice, because you want to make sure to drink that pretty quickly, or for jams or something, you can still do that with these fresh market grapes. So that's still a very good option for some of these berries. But your next very important consideration is going to be your flower type. So muscadines can come in either female fruit, female species, female individuals, or as a perfect flower. And mostly that makes a difference if you're only going to have one vine. If you only have one vine, you need to make sure that it's a self-fertile vine, or else you're really just not going to get any fruit. But they're all going to be labeled as such. So if you go out and are choosing your cultivar, they're going to have that reminder if you are going to have a female quality fruit. You want to make sure that you have a self-fertile one so that you have pollen handy. But female cultivars, while the perfect flowers tend to be more popular for more commercial varieties, that can be for a variety of reasons that we'll get to. But the female varieties tend to have lower yields. That's because one, some of the fruit. So if we look at these female flowers, a lot of times these are the caps that pop off when bloom is starting to happen, and sometimes they don't come off as easily. And then the pollen is not necessarily going to be right there where the flower is in order to pollinate, which sometimes can happen in self-fertile plants before even the cap comes off. But they have more issues with pollination in the female fruit. But with that, they come bigger berries generally, and they tend to be really tasty berries. So even though there's less of them, they do tend to be a really tasty option. But the biggest thing for the flower type, if you're going to have only one vine, you want to make sure that it's a self-fertile one, is the biggest thing that I want you to take away from this slide. Some people, most of the muscadines that we grow will have seeds in them, which can actually have a lot of very good health benefits. But they're not necessarily, like, I spit the seeds out, I always have. And there are a lot of breeders that are working on seedless varieties, and some of them are commercially available, although they do tend to be not very prevalent. It's not widely available, as because there's only a couple different varieties that have only recently been released, so it takes a little time before they can be adopted, and we don't really have as much information on these. But a lot of times they are what is called a wide hybrid, which is they were able to successfully breed a Euvitis bunch drape and a muscadine, which they have two different numbers of chromosomes, so that can sometimes be a little tricky. So it's really impressive when they actually get a very viable, successful cultivar from this. But there's going to be a lot more options coming down the road for some seedless varieties. Those will generally be much smaller fruit, but they still can be very tasty. I actually had a very tasty couple out of the breeding program in Arkansas, which is where a lot of that work is currently being done. And then our size preference. So like I said, the self-fertile cultivars tend to have smaller fruit, although then the smaller fruit does tend to be more consistent in size. But there are also a lot of these newer cultivars that are self-fertile that are still going to have very large fruit. So Hulk and Ruby Crisp are both out of the UGA breeding program that have been released. I believe they were released in 2017 and 2019. That are one delicious. I'm a big fan of both of them, and they're huge. They're generally about as big as some of the female cultivars. But you can see somewhat of that difference. So Supreme is a female cultivar, and it's next to our Pollyanna, which is has a more uneven ripening. And normally I wouldn't recommend the Pollyanna cultivar for a commercial planting, just because it has even more inconsistent, uneven ripening than a lot of other cultivars. But that can be fine. That can actually be a really nice thing in a homeowner setting, because you want there to be fruit on there in the vine all the time. So we also have different color choices that we can look into. The most popular that we'll see most often are going to be our bronze and our purple colors. And sometimes they'll use other terms like black and red and pink. These new Ruby Crisps and the Scarlet, which is also a redder variety, do tend to be a much more brilliantly red option. But generally we're gonna mostly be sticking to the purple or black cultivars and the bronze varieties. People tend to have very strong preferences on the color. They do tend to have some similar tastes between the colors. So some of you may have very specific preferences on that. One thing I want to keep in mind for the color choice is that while this is a loose rule and is not always consistent, but generally the darker the berry, the more disease resistant to different fruit rots. So that's something to keep in mind if you don't want to have to worry about spraying fungicides on your muscadine. And like I said, we have some staggered development within the cultivars. If you just harvest muscadines all at the same time, you're going to have a very range of readiness. So here we have a harvest bucket that has some very unripe fruits in here. So these would be unpalatable, and you want to pick those out entirely, along with much more riper fruits, which is fine if you're fine getting rid of some stuff, but it also means that you could be picking stuff later in the day. This was on September 13th of this year in the Pulk group. But you can see that even in these cultivars, even in the bunches where you have a small bunch, but there's just a range of readiness along in the bunch throughout. So that happens within the same plants, but that also can change based on the cultivar. Some of them will have longer periods of ripening, and some of them will be early, mid-season, or late-season cultivars. They will often be labeled as such, but here are a couple of the more popular ones that could be very good options. So we'll go into a little bit more of these, but this will be available as you look back on it as well. Dry stem scar is also generally mentioned in all of the information when you look at cultivars, and that what that means is just how well the berries come up off of its cluster rachis, off the bunch stem. If it's a wet scar, this doesn't necessarily matter as much if you're going to eat it fairly fresh, but if it's something that you're looking to store for a longer period of time, it'll be more important to have a dry scar. And that'll vary based on the cultivar. So even in this grouping, you can see where there's more there is some wet scars in this and some dry scars in this grouping. So that's not necessarily very important in a homeowner setting, but it's something to keep in mind as you're looking through some of these cultivar informations. And then we have disease resistant. So like I mentioned, muscadines, because they're adapted to the Southeast, generally have much fewer disease issues than most other grapes since they're here, but it does tend to be easier to grow some of the more purple varieties. They tend to be a little more resistant to some of the fruit rots. Particularly if you, like in Pike County, this is not as big of an issue as if you were on the coastal side of this because of that high humidity. If you're in a very, very high humidity area, you do tend to have more risk of fruit rots. But that's something to keep in mind if you don't want to have to worry about spraying fungicides or working at that. You may want to choose a purple variety because it'll be a little bit more resistant to those. And cold hardiness, this is really generally not going to be, I think, too much of a problem in Pike County. But I do want to show y'all just a little bit on how to look for it. If we do have a cold snap, I'm not sure exactly how low it got in the December freeze, but over here near Athens, we definitely did see some muscadine vines that were starting to show some cold stress. How that happens, like sometimes they can recover just fine. It can cause some trunk splitting, which potentially can be recovered from. If it starts to split the trunk, it just might be a little bit weaker in the meantime. Some stress, cold stress is most likely the cause of sometimes stress coming from aerial roots. So here we have along the cordon of this vine are just draped with aerial roots, which this is a sign of stress from the vine. And generally aerial roots are going to be caused by cold stress in the vine. So that's something to keep an eye on. Again, not as much of an issue up in North Carolina. They can have more problems with cultivars like Supreme, tends to be a little more weak to cold temperatures. But something to keep in mind to look out for, even though I don't think it'll be too much of a problem for y'all. As a very clear cue of this, this is over at the in Arkansas near Fayetteville. This is a large commercial producer. These are both two processing grapes, Noble and Carlos, that normally we think of Carlos as a more winter sensitive one, and that's because it breaks bud earlier than Noble does, and so it's more susceptible to spring frosts than Noble will be. But to absolute cold temperatures, it does appear that it's potentially more tolerant to cold temperatures. So this grouping here is the Carlos, and this group here is the Polk, or not the Polk, the Noble. That this is the results after they had a very, very cold freeze back in 2021 in Arkansas. It got down to, I believe, -15 degrees at this site, and somehow the Carlos was fine, but our Noble didn't work out so well. But as you're choosing your varieties, if you're just going with one vine, one good option would be Ison. That is a variety right here in Georgia, named after the nursery owner, Ison. It is a mid-season, self-fertile, very productive, healthy plant that should grow very well. That can be a very good option if you just want one vine. If you want to do two vines, it can be nice to have an early grape like Hall, that's a bronze variety, and Supreme, which is one of the more popular table grape muscadines, which is a mid to late season group. And that the Supreme is a female berry, so we need to make sure to pair that with a self-fertile early variety such as Hall. But those are the recommendations for 1 or 2 vines from Patrick Connor, who I asked before this presentation what his opinion was, coming from the breeder perspective. Here are several other purple varieties. These are all purple varieties that I did mention here, and their flower type and those options. But I'll talk about a couple of these. So this is that Ison. It's going to have that medium-sized berry. It tends to be much more consistent and productive and healthy of a plant, and while also having a very good flavor. Though Patrick did say that he really preferred Delicious, and not only did it have a drier scar, but he preferred the flavor of the Delicious over the Ison cultivar. But if you're just growing one, this is a really great option. That's that Delicious. It looks very similar, but it's going to be a little less vigorous, less productive. This is one just like the Supreme that you really want to make sure that you don't overcrop. You don't put more fruit on, let it grow more fruit on the vine than it really can sustain very well. This one does tend to be a little bit harder to get your hands on, this variety, but it can be a very delicious option. Hall, so this is the bronze grape that he mentioned. It's an early buster that is good vigor, it's productive. Again, this is probably going to be a little bit more sensitive to some of the fruit rots, but it's not necessarily as sensitive as some of the other bronze varieties. But it's a really great option as a early break variety for growing table grapes. This is that Supreme. This is the female, and it's probably the most popular fresh market muscadine that there is. It is delicious, but it's a little bit more sensitive to a plant. It's a lower vigor plant. It's one that you really want to make sure that you don't overcrop, because you will damage the vine if you just continue to overstress it. And then you're also just not going to get as fully developed berries that way. Not as much of a concern. It's not as cold hardy. But it's a really good option for growing in Pike County, I would say. Pulk, though, I personally, if I were growing the grapes, I would probably put Pulk in before I put Supreme in. It's a little bit healthier, although it's still going to be one that you don't want to overcrop very much. We have a big planting of this in our research vineyard that I have eaten myself silly eating some of these Pulk muscadines, and I'm happy as a claim to do so. But this is a self-fertile main season cultivar. It's got huge berries. It's about the same size as Supreme berries, and it's generally pretty good at keeping for a little bit longer for some of these. And then I do want to just mention some of the juice muscadines. The 2 most popular are going to be your Carlos and your Noble. Again, these are juice muscadines, so they're going to be much smaller fruit, and they're going to be both extremely vigorous plants. One of the reasons, especially that Carlos tends to be a little more susceptible to fruit rots, is because it's so dense. There's so much plant material, it's all collected. So even if you do spray, it's sometimes harder to get penetration within the center of those canopies because it's just huge. But is delicious. It kind of looks just like those scuppernongs. So a lot of times people will pull these and be like, oh, I love the scuppernongs. But again, this is a Carlos variety. The Noble is the red counterpart to that. Is very good as a juice made into wine. It does tend to hold color a little bit better because a lot of times those purple cultivars don't hold on to that color. But one thing for this, you want to make sure that you don't let if you're making wine out of Noble, you don't want to let your juice sit on the skins for very long, a couple days at most, or else you start pulling some bad flavors out of the skins for those. So that's a little bit different for growing muscadine wine versus a bunch grape wine. But I'm going to be talking about a couple other resources that y'all have to look more into this. The muscadine grape breeding page is beautiful. It's sorted a lot of this information It goes through more cultivars than I've talked about here on this slide, along with notes on all of them. It goes into more of the juice cultivars if you're interested in a juice cultivar, but don't necessarily want to stick with Carlos or Noble. There are other options available that we have notes on that are all based in Tifton, but can be fairly similar. Should be fairly similar to, at least more similar than a lot of the other programs, I should say. But in any case, you could just Google UGA grape breed, muscadine grape breeding, and you'll come up with this page, or the website is there. But now we'll move into our cultural practices, which I need to move a little faster. So here we just have a big poster on viticulture management, which we are currently in the process of getting a new one made for the muscadine management. Your lovely agent Brooklyn helped us review this page, and so it's currently in the design phase, and so I'm hoping that in the spring, I'm hoping that it'll be able to be released, and I'll show you where you can find that in a little while. But this is mostly just to help kind of cue you to the kind of practices that you need to do at different points in your vine development. So you have your phenology that goes from dormant to bud swell to bud break all the way through harvest. And it just kind of touches on either the cultural practices that you need to work on or the pinchal disease and insects that you have to deal with. The good thing for muscadine management is that it requires way fewer of these tasks and diseases than in regular bunch grapes, but a lot of them are very similar. But if you're putting in brand new grapes, the biggest thing that you need to consider is that you need a lot of sun. These are full sun plants. While you can grow them in a little bit of shade, they will not be as productive. They'll be much smaller. They need to be babied a little bit more if you're going to keep them in partial shade. That's why if you're putting up rows of trellis, multiple rows, you want to make sure that you get at least a 1-to-1 ratio from the height of the trellis to the distance between the rows. And that just kind of helps make sure that you get enough sunlight between the two. And the other big thing is you need good soil drainage. Muscadines do not like wet feet. Please do not let them sit in a puddle because they'll not be very happy that way. But in general, they're fairly tolerant of a lot of different soil types. You do want to make sure to take some soil tests beforehand, which Brooklyn can help you do that. And then you can make sure that, one, you can tell kind of what is in your soil before you plant. If you have very acidic soil, the easiest way to manage this is before you put the plants in. Very acidic soil can be a little bit rougher on the muscadines than otherwise. So you want to, ideally, you want that soil pH to be between a 6 and a 6.5. But sometimes we have soils as low as a 4, which is a little, definitely way too acidic for some of these vines. As I talk about some of these parts of the vine, I'm sure y'all can all pick out the trunk, but the cordon is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this, the part of the trunk that's going across the top wire. Most muscadines are going to be sitting on a high wire trellis system, and that's just, we'll see that a little bit more readily in the next slide. But you'll grow up your trunk and have a cordon going in both directions away from your trunk. So normally they're going to have 2 different arms sticking out. And then all of your fruit is going to come off of the shoots that grow each new season. And a sucker is just going to be any shoots that are going to pop out from the main trunk of your vine. But again, like I said, the high wire trellis is going to be your most common and easiest trellis system that you can build to grow muscadines. They grow very well for this. Normally, one, I really like this figure in that you can see the vines are placed right next to the posts. As muscadines grow, they tend to be very big and heavy. And so if you put them right next to the posts, they can have a little bit more support in order to grow a little bit more effectively. And these are big, healthy, vigorous vines. And so you want to give them a lot of space. The commercial recommendation is generally to put at least 15 to 20 feet of space between each trunk. The higher vigor your cultivar. So if you're running a Carlos, you want to make sure that it's given lots of room. For some of your lower vigor cultivars like Supreme, you can shrink that size a little bit more. Mismatching the amount of space that you give a vine and the cultivar, really just, if you give it too much space, it can lead to vine stress if you're trying to grow more vine than you can sustain. It will stress out your vine and it will die more readily. If you don't give it enough space, it's just going to be overly dense. You're going to be more at risk for diseases. One of the things I don't like about this image, though, is one, it shows two different vines growing off of the same trellis. Really, we want vines to be given two different directions, ideally, to grow, or at least given a little bit more space if you're going to have it grow in one direction. And the biggest thing I don't like about this picture is they've got the cordons wrapped around that high wire system, which is good when you first start to train your vine, because it can help make sure that your vine stays along the wire. But as you start to get bigger, thicker wood, you want to unwrap it and then just use like a tie to help make sure it stays there. Because otherwise, as it continues to grow, it will girdle itself along that wire. So that's one thing to keep in mind for that. Another option is a Geneva double curtain, which this is not necessarily a great option for some of the larger commercial vineyards, but this is a good way to get a little bit higher yield in a smaller space for homeowners. It takes a little bit more equipment, but it also can help you grow only in one direction if you want to have your two arms growing in one direction. And it can also increase your canopy density, which is not necessarily what you want, but it can be a fine option. So this is also a very solid potential. The one thing that's also different for this, which I won't mention later, but if you are growing in a Geneva double curtain, as you're doing your canopy management, you just want to make sure that you break these centers of the canopy that's growing in between this. So just like knock the stuff down so that it has enough room to not get all tied up into each other. And one of the worst things that I see is people putting the vines in the ground and then just kind of ignoring them. The baby vines are going to be much more sensitive than your adult vines. You can ignore a mature established vine much more than you can some of these baby vines, just because they haven't gotten enough resources to give themselves that backup. So while you don't necessarily need irrigation on your muscadines, you may need that for the baby vines if you get through a very dry period, especially in that first year, because they really don't have the root system to establish. You want to add some fertilizers, can help them make sure that they grow. This is going to depend on the soil type that you have. You want to keep the area around the vine weed free. A lot of times in some of these established vineyards, you'll see much denser weed floor growth, but that's not ideal. But we'll move into a little bit of vine training, which we'll go through very quickly. It's going to take 3 years in order to get fruit off these vines. If you have a good growing vine, you want to make sure that you plan that it's going to be 3 years before you get any fruit off of your muscadines. You can, in theory, push it to get it off of year 2, but you really would prefer not to do that, if at all possible, just because it's going to be a much healthier vine in the long term if you let it establish fully before you start pulling the fruit off of the vines. So you'll start by growing with your suckers. You'll get a couple different suckers that are going to pop up. You can get shoots that are going to be of many different widths. Some stuff will grow a little faster than you want it to. If it's really, really thick shoot, that's not necessarily a good thing either. You want it to be kind of look good, look healthy, and be about a pencil width thick, or maybe a little bit thicker than that, is what you're going to focus on when you're growing all your new vines. But we're just going to scoot through that. This will be available as you look through it later. The slides will be available on the website as well if you just want the slides. But fertilizers, let's talk about fertilizers. The amount and if there's any micronutrients that you need to supplement the vines with are going to depend on the soils that you're using. If you have very healthy soils, you may not need to add anything to the vines, but a lot of the soils that are around are necessarily going to be a little bit emptier soils, I should say. And if you have acidic soil, if you have too acidic of soil, which is more often the case here in Georgia, that'll make some of the nutrients that are there less available to the vine. So here are a couple just recommendations for getting your fertilizers on as they grow. Year 1, you're going to want 3 different small applications. Year 2 is the same. You're just going to increase your rate. All of these are going to go on in the spring from about April, March. It'll be some of your first applications. You'll get these planted in April. Is probably the best time to get these planted. And then you can fertilize through July if you need to. After July, you can to some extent fertilize, but you have a potential of disrupting your vine going into dormancy. So be careful about late fertilization for these. Year 3 is when you're going to start to get your first crop if the vines are looking healthy, if they're growing well. If they're not growing well, you just want to fertilize them like you were fertilizing them in year 2, and just kind of help them continue to get fully established. Especially if you have really big trellises, sometimes it needs that just to make sure that it can get fully onto those giant trellis systems before you start to stress it out by growing fruit. You still want to add fertilizers to your established vines. You don't need to do it as often. Mostly one solid application in the spring can be just fine for the muscadines. But again, while you do want to make sure that you check your soil pH before you plant, you sometimes need to check it again and again, especially if you do the most economical way, I should say. Most economical way to adjust your soil pH is going to be before you plant. But sometimes you need to continue to adjust that as the vine grows. So if you check your acidity every 3 years and it's getting a little low, you can add some dolomitic lime. Generally that's done in the winter, but it can be done at many points in the season in order to help raise the pH into a more acceptable level for those vines. And dolomitic lime will also have magnesium in it. Magnesium deficiency is one of the biggest issues that we're going to see in muscadines. If you have a severe problem, like this vine here is not only stressed out from some winter injury, but is also a little low on magnesium. So in this case, while I would certainly recommend probably this vineyard adding dolomitic lime in the winter, they may also add some Epsom salts around the vine to supplement that. It's a lengthy process to change any of your soil nutrient availability, but sometimes it can take a couple different methods to get that going. An optional task you can do in that is also to collect tissue nutrient samples. That can be a little bit, it's a little more expensive than doing the soil tests, but it can tell you more realistically what your vine nutrition status is looking like. For a good comparison for this is comparing like a soil test is kind of like looking at your box of Cheerios that you eat every morning and being like, okay, well, here are my nutrients that I'm getting every day, versus a tissue sample test is more like looking at your blood test and seeing kind of just what is actually in your system to look at. So that's a good way to think about that. And you can do it really at a lot of different times in the season, but ideally you want to do it consistently if you're going to do it consistently, but at a consistent time. So this is going to be either at bloom or at veraison if you choose one of those options. My preference is veraison, which is when you're changing from berry growth to berry ripening, which is also kind of a drawn out amount of time for the muscadines, but that's when you're going to see the colors starting to change in all the berries, which is easier to see in the purple varieties, but you can still see the colors start to change in your bronze varieties as well. I really will not have time to go into pruning. I have a workshop planned in the fall for grapevine pruning, and muscadine pruning if y'all are interested into that. But this is a required task. If you're gonna keep a healthy muscadine present, then you want to make sure that you're going to come in and do your pruning every winter. If you're going to ignore everything else that I've said, make sure to just prune your muscadines. It's going to help keep your vine healthier. It's going to help keep the fruit coming and the fruit growing to where it should be and where it'll actually ripen correctly. So this is kind of the most important part. You want to go for that. And generally you want to do it around February I would say for Pike County. Hedging, you just want to make sure that your vines aren't sitting on the ground. So the timing for that can change based on how your vine is growing and how often you are willing to hedge it. And floor management. Again, this is most important for the baby vines, but trying to keep the weeds from overrunning and outcompeting your vine is going to be important. If you're going through with a mower or a weed whacker, though, just be very careful not to hit your vine because that'll cause what we like to joke as mower blight. It can cause damage to your vine and it will impede its growth further on. But while I'm hoping that y'all never have to deal with any of these pest and disease issues, sometimes they do come. And so I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the more common ones so you can know to keep an eye out for those. There's going to be much more information that's present and updated each year in the Southeast Regional Muscadine Guide. This is the just picture of the 2023 guide that's available online. But this is updated every year. We're currently working on getting the last edits done for the 2024 book, which will be out in the spring. But this is a good option to look at a lot of the details that you're going to need for pest and disease, both identifying and managing pest and diseases. This is going to be more of a problem generally in more established vines, but when you have issues with your trunks. Trunk disease often is going to be like, if you're just saying, oh, trunk disease, people often are referring to like Botrytis dieback is a complex of fungi, which are generally more prevalent in the winter, and they require rain in order to infect. But this is going to be more of a problem if you have lots of exposed pruning wounds, like just huge exposed pruning wounds that are not protected. Trunk disease does not move very fast, so you can prune, you can strategize your pruning in order to reduce the issues for this. But the most common way for this to appear is if you're getting apart just a section of your vine that is starting to look it's starting to wilt, it's starting to die back, while especially when the other side of the vine looks just fine. And if you start to see a couple of issues around the edge of that vine, if you then make a pruning cut and you see this wedge of darker tissue along with healthier tissue, this is generally a good sign that you've got this trunk disease problem. You can just prune it out, which ideally it's more often going to happen along the cordons. And if it does happen on the cordon, you can just trim back in order to find healthy tissue. And so this is something that you can work through, but something to keep an eye out for in established vines, especially. Crown gall often happens. It's a bacteria that takes off and starts to make your vine grow more wood in wrong places, so it interrupts the vascular system as well. This is more common when there is winter injury, or if you have mower or weed whacker injury to your trunk. So it requires there to be injury before it can take over as well, and is more likely to happen closer to the base of the trunk, which makes it harder to prune out, even though this is also something that can theoretically be pruned out as well. Then the fruit rots are going to be the much more other common issue. It's generally more common each season, I should say, for your muscadines. We've got 3 different kinds on this slide: ripe rot, black rot, and bitter rot, which all kind of look similar and are sometimes treated, can be often treated all at the same time. And then you've got one more rot and then a couple of not technically rots, but these are often done, will cause issues earlier in the season. or they'll cause issues early in the season that you don't see until later in the season. And so if you've already started to see these rots present in the vineyard or on your vine, the biggest thing is to remove your diseased tissue as soon as possible and get it further away from the vine. And that can help reduce some of the inoculum present to help reduce that pressure in the past. If it continues to be a big prevalent issue here, then you may need to come in potentially with a fungicide if you've got very prevalent fruit rot damage. Unlike diseases, insects generally, you don't really control them until after you start to see that they're present. So Japanese beetles and June beetles are much more attracted to a lot of the other plants that are available. But if you start to see these in really high numbers and they're starting to cause a lot of these skeletonized leaves in the vineyard, like if you're in the vine, if it's starting to eat back a lot of your tissue, then this is something that you may need to address. But normally we really do not see this occur to an extent that we're worried about. And then grape root borer, this can be a little bit more of an issue. This tends to be a more established vineyard location. If you are digging up a dead vine or some very injured vine, you're digging a vine up and you start to see these grubs, which are pretty gross, but you start to see those, that may indicate that you have other issues in some of the other vines that are present. The adults will emerge in the summer, and then they'll also molt and leave their casings around. So you're more likely to be able to see these casings on the ground near the vines of an infected vineyard in the spring. And you may not catch an adult, but you may find one present. A lot of times commercial growers will use pheromone bait traps in order to catch the adults to see if that will be a concern. But again, the management for these doesn't happen until after, and then you would want to reference your pest management guide in order to figure out how you want to manage that. One option for these, which will be much more viable for some of the smaller operations, such as a homeowner, if you have these grape root borers present, you can potentially counteract some of their damage by mounding soil around your vine, which this doesn't necessarily help the vine that is currently having the issue, but it can prevent it from spreading further. So you essentially just take a bunch of soil and mound it up about 1 foot high and at least 1.5 feet out from the base of the vine. And that just prevents some of your larvae from emerging, and so they can't get out and they don't spread further than that. But if you do that, you do want to make sure that you take the mounding down in about November, or maybe a little bit before, a little bit after, but about November, in order to make sure that you don't start growing aerial roots along the trunk for that as well. But I've mentioned our resources. The UGA Extension Viticulture blog is going to focus on both bunch grapes and muscadines. This is going to be the website where I have this presentation present as well. You can link to the verb, but we also have a newsletter that comes out. And so this will be a place that you can get just occasional emails. It doesn't happen very often, and it's definitely no more than one a day, but it's generally no more than one a week. But you can sign up for the newsletter, and that's where we'll announce both some events that are happening on grapes specifically, as well as we'll send out the muscadine management poster, and it'll just mention some of the issues that are happening like concurrently. But I've referenced all of these resources as we've talked through this day, so I'll leave it on this slide as we can go through any questions. But the biggest portion, so that's the viticulture website. This is one that I will send out information on regularly. The muscadine breeding, that's where you're going to find more information on the different muscadine cultivars, as well as some other stuff that Dr. Patrick Connor has put out, and then some other muscadine related extension publications. So this is the viticulture management poster that will be soon to be specific for muscadines, or is going to have a new one out there. But with that, yes, that's my last slide that I have on there, so I'll leave it on these resources slide, but I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all have.